for those of us who don't really know what basic income guarantee is, can you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. So the main principle of basic income is an income floor, which no one can fall beneath, and it's a guarantee that no matter what your work status is or any other conditions, you're guaranteed a minimum amount of money every year that you can rely on. And there's different ways of administering a basic income and also different models that are conceptualized, but cross-cutting is this principle of universality and guarantee.
So will all
fall no lower than a certain level.
So is everyone going to be applied to the same level, or will different people have different levels that they have to abide to?
Well, it depends slightly on the type, the model of basic income that is adopted by, a government or a system. Essentially, the negative income tax model, which is typically the most common that people talk about, is a guaranteed amount of money that no one can fall below. But if you make more than that amount of money, then you wouldn't, necessarily get the exact same amount of money as somebody who fell below that level. So some people talk about a universal demogrant, everybody in the entire society getting, a certain amount of money every month, and other people talk about a negative income tax, which is more like a guarantee that you will make no less than this amount of money. But if you already, have that level of income, then if you get it, it might be taxed back or something like that. So we talk about it in principle as being the same amount of money for every single person, but with progressive taxation, it would likely be taxed back for people at a higher income level.
So on your website, I know that it says income sufficient to meet basic needs and to live with dignity. So can you tell me what you mean by these basic needs and what you mean by living with dignity?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things that we find problematic with the current welfare system in Canada is that it's a patchwork of social programs, and there are often many conditions that people need to meet in order to access income support right now in Canada. And furthermore, when they do access income support provisions that from working and from there's all kinds of specific criteria that you need to meet, and those are often disincentivizing and give people not enough control over their own income and their own choices in life. So we believe that a basic income would simplify all of that and would allow people to have the assurance of, just a basic amount of money, nothing glamorous, but something that will allow for basic needs to be met, and that will not have some of the same restrictive conditions of the current welfare system, so that people can make choices that are best for them in their own lives. They can choose to invest in their education. They can, spend a little bit more on housing, a little bit more on food, whatever meets their needs.
So how is basic income different from something like minimum wage or like a welfare program?
Yeah, great question. I think the main difference with minimum wage is that not everybody in our society can access the labor market, and increasingly I'm convinced that not everybody should. With the mechanization of labor, I think we're seeing employment change very dramatically in our society, and probably in our lifetime it will look very different because of exponential technological growth. And so what it means to work is changing, and I think that's appropriate, and we need our support systems to keep up with that. So the answer to your question about how it's different from a guaranteed minimum wage that's at a livable level, well, not everybody works, and there's people in our society who for whatever reason have breaks from the labor market, or take time off from working to invest in their education, or to have children and raise the next generation of our society. And I think that there's a lot of value in the kinds of labor right now that are not being compensated for. So I think if you have a high enough minimum wage, that's very important, and that protects dignity and workers' rights in its own capacity, and I believe that we should have a strong minimum wage, but there are a lot of people for whom a wage is not a guarantee of income because they're not participating in the labor market the same way that others are. And then the way it's different from current welfare programs, I think I already touched on the conditionality and some of the restrictive clauses that once people are on welfare, it's very hard to get off, and it's very hard to support your welfare income by, taking on something part-time, because then you get clawed back. And so a guaranteed annual income would not require all of the same conditions that the welfare system does, and it would give people a little bit more freedom and flexibility.
What would determine this basic income? Would it fluctuate with inflation, or is it just based on living standards? Like, what factors would come into play when determining this basic income?
Well, it's complex, and I think we advocate for the government to consider it, and for the Canadian public to consider and discuss and debate about what would be most appropriate. I think you would need to think about what other supports are in place, and yes, it would probably need to change over time as inflation continues to grow. And there would be a lot of, jurisdictional considerations depending on the social services that are provided in those areas and what already exists. So I think that's actually a considerable challenge that the next stage we'll see how the government and how the Canadian public takes it on. But there are a lot of factors to consider for sure.
So how would it work? Is it just money that's given to residents, say, at the end of every year, at the end of every fiscal year? How would it work?
It could be distributed. It could be determined annually through a taxation system, distributed monthly. How it works depends on who adopts it and how it fits in with other existing programs. But I think one of the simplest ways to administer it would be through the taxation system, determined annually, but probably administered more frequently than that.
So some detractors would say that given a basic income or a minimum income, that people will be more reluctant to work. Like, what would you say to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. It comes up often, and I think that's our knee-jerk reaction. We think that if people have the security of an income, that they won't work. But the reality is, in a lot of pilot projects, we haven't actually seen any evidence of that. In the Minkum project in the 70s in particular, there were only 2 groups who statistically significantly changed their labor force participation. So even though everybody got this guaranteed income, only 2 groups actually changed their participation, and they were fairly positive changes from my perspective. So we saw women taking longer maternity leave, so spending time at home with their kids, and we saw young men in high school staying in high school and finishing their diplomas. So both of those things, I think, represent positive changes in labor market participation, and it does combat what we typically think of, that that people will quit their jobs or stop working. And I think the other interesting labor market participation effect that we've seen in some of the international experiments, Namibia and India, we've seen people be more likely to be entrepreneurial and start small businesses, because it's, you have a little bit of protection. If the business fails, if you have to go bankrupt for some reason, you're guaranteed at least to have basic necessities, and you don't, you don't need to worry about losing your life if you take on a business venture that doesn't work. So I think we're talking about an amount that's not very glamorous, and I know I sure wouldn't stop what I'm doing. I love my job, and even on the days I don't love my job, I still like, I still like the income that I get, and I know I wouldn't change my life if I had a basic income, but I might be more likely in the future to consider other education opportunities, or, to be a little bit more flexible with my planning, just because I have this assurance of a basic income. So we actually don't expect people to stop working in a significant capacity, and that's based on the evidence that we've seen from the pilot experiments.
So essentially, it's kind of like a safety net, I guess, for people to pursue different careers that they want to do and just kind of pursue their passions and don't have to worry about like struggling every day and working for the hour and just kind of busting their butts for $10, $11 an hour.
That's exactly it. Yeah, it's an insurance policy. It's a way to sort of stimulate the creative sectors and to give people a chance to try doing something that they love without worrying about whether or not they're going to end up on the streets.
Most Canadian taxpayers are concerned about, will they have to pay more? Will taxpayers be asked to pay more?
I hope not. I think that there are creative ways to fund a basic income that don't require a huge burden on individual taxpayers. I think that we could get creative with things like corporate taxation. I think a lot of, actually there would be a lot of reductions in some of the downstream effects of what we're seeing from the consequences of not having a guaranteed income. So, extra burden on the health and social safety systems, and even the justice system. All of those things are impacted by poverty and by people not having the resources in their lives that they need. So I think that we might see some savings in those areas, and we would be able to reinvest that in a basic income program. I think corporate tax is a good option. I think that, and maybe some individual tax levels would change too. It's possible that the highest income earners could, that we could shift around taxation rates there. But for the most part, I think it's possible to fund a system through some restructuring of existing social safety services and also through downstream savings.